I'm pleased and proud to announce that our guest today is Lynsey Scott, joining us for the Low Code Marathon. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I imagine one of the first questions you often get asked is likely about your career path, given that you're now successful in two fields of acting and modeling as well as technology, and some might view these as divergent or separate paths. Perhaps you can share with the audience how you ended up in this position today.
Okay. Well, when I was about 12, I picked up my first TI-89 graphing calculator. And it came with a book of documentation, and I used that documentation to create games without really realizing that I was coding at the time. But when I ended up at Amherst College, and I knew I wanted to be a theater major because I loved acting so much, I had time to explore other fields because of the open curriculum. At first, I tried theater and econ, and then theater and physics, and finally, I landed on computer science. I took my first computer science course. I fell in love with it, and I realized that I had been doing it when I was 12 even, without even knowing it. I loved the way that working with algorithms and machine learning, lower level languages, logic gates, all of that felt like playing a game in a way, a logic game the same way it did when I was 12.
You must have been a very special child. I struggled in college using my calculator, and you were reading documentation for it. So that's I think you found your calling early.
I saw it as a means to an end. I loved games. I think a lot of kids do. And this, that idea of being able to create them on your own, it was exciting to me.
Powerful. Well, if that was your first kind of programming experience, now that you've had much more, is there a programming language that you actually prefer to use today? You have a preference?
Yeah. Well, I'm an iOS developer. That's my job.
Okay.
So I work in Swift primarily, but I also work in other. Honestly,
Yeah.
most languages are pretty much the same. It's always a means to an end, depending on the platform you're using. So I'm fine with working with anything as long as it creates what I want it to create.
Well, given the audience that we have today here, and they've joined us for the Low Code Marathon, I think the audience would be curious to know, have you ever considered or had any experience with low code or no code development platforms? And if so, what thoughts have you?
Sure. Well, when I work, obviously I get paid to code, and the more code I do, the better because I get paid per hour. So that's good for me. Probably not so good for the companies. I'm sure they'd love to save some money with lower code. But if you think about it, the code I do is the low code from yesterday, and I'm sure the low code today is the code of tomorrow. I think that as time goes on, we've moved from zeros to ones to higher and higher level programming language. And I'm sure that the low code is what everyone's going to be doing at some point. And yeah, I have worked with low code at marathons when I'm mentoring people who aren't so experienced at coding. We'll use things that drag and drop code around in order to make something that they can be proud of and excited of, and that's working and is useful without that much experience and without that much time.
Let me shift gears a moment. I appreciate that perspective, and I know you've done a lot of speaking, a lot of events, particularly focused on women in tech, and looking across getting the youth into technology and coding. So in your opinion, what are maybe some of the three biggest stereotypes in IT about gender?
Well, I think there are plenty. I on most of the projects I work on, I'm one of very few women in the company, and one of the few people of color, and I'm definitely always the only Black woman on a team. And when it comes to the actual development, actual programmers, there are very, very few female developers. So I think that sometimes people are surprised to see me on a job and to see that I know what I'm doing. For example, when I first moved to LA, this is actually one of the reasons I started getting back into programming. I became kind of tired of the modeling industry in so many different ways. And at a certain point, I realized that I wanted to transition out of that.
Mhm.
And so towards the end of the time that I was really into modeling, where I was traveling all over the world, I was on planes, probably 3 times a week. I was exhausted. I was kind of tired of, rejection and shaming and all that. When I knew that I wanted to get out of it, that's when I started focusing on my phone that I just received, my iPhone. And I learned how to make things specifically for my device. Because just like when I was 12, that's what I had. And I knew that there was lots of documentation online for me to learn how to manipulate that into creating things that I wanted to create. So when I moved to LA, I knew that I wanted to focus on acting, and I was producing a show at the time too. And I just kept on programming until I could make my living from iOS development, from software engineering in general. And that's what I do now in order to earn a living. The original question was, before I went off on my little tangent there.
No, that was good. I mean, well, let's pivot off of that then and say, so since I know you do a lot of speaking and do a lot of interviewing of other leaders in tech as well, maybe you can share with the audience, what do you think needs to be done in order to help inspire more young women into the computer science field in IT or programming in general?
I think, for one, no one told me what programming was. No one told me anything about tech growing up. So when I was programming, I didn't even know I was programming. So I think it's great for young people to have ways to experiment easily too, using low code and other solutions in order to find out what they're getting themselves into, and use those sort of solutions to hopefully make something actually useful for them.
Sure.
And I realized what you'd asked before was about and it has to do with this too. The fact that there aren't very many women in tech, I think that also scares a lot of girls off when you go into a room and you don't quite feel like you belong. For example, when I first moved to LA, I went to this party in Venice, and it was all male programmers. And I walk into the room, the conversation just stops, and I say, "Hey, what were you guys talking about?" And they said, "Oh, just programming. You wouldn't be interested."
Oh.
And that's the sort of thing that has happened many times. Luckily for me, I'm a contract developer, so I have people advocating for me, getting me jobs at this point. So I don't have as much to prove anymore when it comes to my work. But in social settings with people I don't know, I'm sure I still have something to prove in order to be taken, if I want to be taken the least bit seriously. And I'm sure a lot of girls, and I know for a fact, 50% of women exit technical jobs because of the hostile work environment.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, as far as of like 3 years ago, that was the statistic. And I'm sure actually, I don't think it's been getting better over the past few years. Because I think there's a tendency for a lot of programmers, when they see someone who doesn't quite fit the stereotype, they might think of them as not being a programmer in the same way that they are. For example, it's kind of silly, but on Twitter, I avoid looking at these things sometimes. But I saw this a couple of days ago. Someone tagged me in this post where someone said, that they think that all developers, that no developers care about fashion, for example. It's not, there's no relation, that they're like, but my program, the guys in my company all just wear the same thing pretty much every day.
Right.
And yeah, I think we hear about some tech people, just having this bro attire or whatever it is, but it has nothing to do with how you look, what you wear, your interests. And I think there are a lot of people who a lot of coders who just, maybe they just need to be exposed to more of us, more women and people of color on a day basis.
Definitely so. Well, let me ask a poll of our audience, because we've been focusing on diversity in tech and IT, but there are many other departments and fields that also have this challenge. So a poll for our audience here is, in your organizations, what department do you feel lacks the most diversity? And there are a range of choices from finance, sales, HR, marketing, and IT as well. So I'll be really curious. We'll leave the polls open for the remainder of the session, and we'll be able to review the results at the end. So Lynsey, let me pivot. I really appreciate your perspective on that. I'm sure our audience does too. But I also want to ask about the kind of the future of the development world. So you talked about, you're using Swift now, which, as you mentioned, is kind of the low code of the past, because prior to that you had to write native, right? And so our vision at Creatio, of course, is a future where low code companies exist, and citizen developers is the term that's been coined for really business people who didn't program on their calculator and come up with that, don't know how to read the documentation, but are empowered to create applications or automate business processes. But I want to get your take on where you see, since you're living in this world as a paid developer now, the future of this going maybe in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, there is a huge gap in the number of developers wanted and the number of developers that actually exist. So I think that we definitely need coding or no coding to be more accessible for everyone. Because just as technology is growing year after year, the demand is for actual people who can develop. It's growing year after year, and it's the sort of thing that I think everyone should be able to do, or will have to be able to do, in order to have job security in the future.
Well, they've been saying for a long time about every company being in some degree a technology company. I think, to your point, I think there's maybe only 25 million developers trying to satisfy the demands for maybe 500 million applications. Do you link these two things though? By the way, so do you see the a low code future, or the democratizing of that IT, the access to it, being tied to helping the diversity challenge that IT faces?
Well, I think there are a lot of issues when it comes to diversity, and there's so many that it's hard to pinpoint the place in tech that needs the most help. But for example, when I do my development for clients, it costs them a good bit of money, and a lot of companies can't afford that without a proper investment. There needs to be more access. And if developing technology isn't as expensive for people at a certain point in the future, then that gives them more opportunities to grow their business without needing that sort of investment from the get-go.
That was an interesting perspective, because you took it more to the financial side of it, which I don't think everybody really realizes. But I mean, you're right, the development costs are high, and so if you can do it for less, faster, that itself, on top of the technology, could have a big impact. Well, let me turn that question to the audience as well. Let's ask us: do you believe that a low code, no code technology makes jobs more inclusive for everyone? And we'll pass that one on to the audience. You mentioned about the lack of developers. So it sounds like for you see this is probably still one of the hot growth areas where people should still be focusing as far as jobs and careers. Do you see any other major changes for the industry and where it's heading?
Yeah, yeah, there have definitely been major changes. When I started doing development work, I would do it from home as a contractor, and I would work remotely with all these different companies and have my own hours, have completely flexible schedule in order to be able to do my other passions, to be able to go to my acting classes and do my auditions. And a lot of companies were resistant to this at first, but things are changing, obviously. It's been a tough year, and I think people, in spite of all the struggles, they realize that there are different ways of doing things in general. And when it comes to work, there's more flexibility there. And I think that also gives people more opportunities to work in ways that are more suited to them. Like for me, where I like the flexibility, I like to be able to pursue different passions. I like how this world that we're living in now allows more of that than it did before.
With that, then, so with the pursuit of your passions, is it possible that you might be willing to share with us some of your personal or particular plans of what you're working on right now? A sneak peek about that?
Yeah, well, for client work, I can't say too much because of security reasons, but I am working on some technology that is being used in vaccine laboratories to make
Wow.
vaccine production safer and more efficient. There used to be an old way of doing things that,
Mhm.
for example, that there was a lab in Maryland that lost 15 million
Oh,
batches of or doses of the vaccine because of some mistakes that were on paper,
wow.
believe it or not. And so this client is now working with that lab and many others in order to digitize vaccine production. And then I also have a contract that is working with the NFL on some. It's an API
Mhm.
essentially.
Wow,
So
very exciting and very different type of projects there.
yeah,
If
and
you did,
for
no,
those, obviously code is great for me since I get paid per hour. But I also have my own project, and I really, really wish that I went in that it was all that I was capable of doing it with as low amount of code as possible, because it would make it much easier to maintain. And you know, and yeah, for that I have a couple different apps related to acting. Actually, I think in general, coding's nothing without having passions. You always have to have
yep,
something to apply it to. And so since my passion's acting, it's nice that I've been able to do some coding or some acting apps on my own.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
you've married the two passions. Lynsey, it's fascinating about the working with an organization in vaccine. Obviously, that's top of mind for everyone, and I imagine it's also a very secure situation where you can't reveal too much. But maybe you can expound a bit on. You mentioned that it was manual processes at the heart of this that was causing the problems, and paper processes, and you were brought in to transform that. So maybe you can talk to us about that aspect.
I was so surprised that they lost, I think it was like 13 or 15 million doses of the vaccine because of the fact that they had like maybe 1,000 pages.
Wow.
Out of those 1,000 pages of paper they used to make the vaccine, they probably forgot one page. They might have accidentally, 2 pages might have been stuck together, who knows? And the whole batch had to be thrown out.
Wow.
So yeah, the company that I'm working with, we have a way to use technology in order to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen again.
How do you approach that? The idea of taking something from that manual world into the technological. What were you? What was the kind of the core tasks that you guys were looking at to do that?
Um, well, my task is about the main thing I'm working on is about teams working together,
Okay.
essentially. But for this company, they've created their own hardware solutions and software, and are kind of combining everything in order to make it as easy as possible for these companies to produce
Okay.
not just vaccines, but medications in the future. Right now, the focus is on vaccines, but for medications in
Well, that's the
general.
focus for everyone, I think, right? But I mean, it sounds like so a combination of collaboration and automation to remove, I guess, the errors or you said of missing
Yes,
one page that's in there. So a lot
yes,
of process mapping, probably.
definitely a lot, a lot.
No, that's fair. I mean, I saw some earlier interviews of several apps. You didn't even mention them now, and you're on telling about these great new vaccine related ones or NFL. So obviously, a lot of exciting things going on for you. Is there any parting statement you'd like to give to our audience, or a piece of advice that you'd like to share?
Um, I think for anyone who is afraid of technology, and a lot of people are afraid of that idea of coding, I think that it's a great idea to start somewhere. And I think that no code is a great way to start learning about what's going on behind your computer screen in there with all the little uh, um, bits of your computer. I I I think I think you should just try, because that's the way things are headed. And I think it's important for our economy, for our world, to have as many diverse voices and uh, interest fueling the technology that we have that it's going to be produced for our future. I guess a lot of people are often talking about how artificial intelligence is being built by people and there's a limited set. And yeah, I'm excited to see once coding is more accessible for everyone, what great software and hardware and everything that can be produced in the future that we haven't seen yet.
Well, amazing.
We haven't had those voices to contribute yet.
Yeah, well, we're aligned, I think, in that, and we're super excited as well when we look at the 1.7 billion knowledge workers out there driving business, and only 25 million of them can actually produce the apps right now. So we do see a lot of potential in the future, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time to spend with us today and share your thoughts and your work with the audience. So thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.